please rise and join us in the pledge? I pledge allegiance
To the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for joining us. Tonight is our first of 4 scheduled budget meetings. I think they basically work out every other week this year. All here on Tuesday nights, starting at the same time, 7:30, right here in this room. So, as you all know, the governor has delivered his proposed budgets with his proposal for state aid runs. We'll talk about those a little later. They're, as usual, not quite as good as they appear to be in Newsday for various reasons. The majority of the increases come in expense-based aid, which means you got to spend money to get the money. Of course, 2 days after the governor released his proposed budget, he came out and said that the state, had a $2.5 billion revenue shortfall. So we'll see how that plays into what the legislature does and what kind of compromise that they will come to. Most of us had attended a legislative breakfast where all of the elected officials, the state senators, state assemblymen, all pledged to fight for additional aid, but that also was right before they announced the shortfall. So Mrs. Burns and I have started a meeting. We already met with Assemblyman LaPetrie. We're going to be meeting with Senator Boyle and Assemblyman Rhea in the next couple of weeks and hopefully get a little better idea of whether or not we can count on the amount the governor proposed or possibly hope for something more. So that's pretty much your legislative update for the night. And with that, I will turn it over to Mrs. Burns.
Thank you, Mr. Geller. So, I know everyone's here actually. So, as you know, it's my responsibility to ensure that our West Side students have the opportunity for learning in various areas that are in compliance with national and state standards, as well as meeting your expectation as West Islip community members in one way or the other. So we want our students to leave West Islip ready for college and or a career, and also to be good citizens in this country, this United States. So this evening, I'm going to give you a very brief overview of the budget process, and Mrs. Alisa Pilate, who is our Assistant Superintendent for Business, will share the first information regarding the first draft of the 2019-20 budget. The budget is a work in progress, and as Mr. Geller pointed out, this is the first of 4 work sessions, and there will be many changes as the month unfolds. In subsequent meetings, you will get more detailed information about the various areas that make up this budget, whether it be curriculum, technology, the arts, special education, security, facilities, etc. So a lot goes into it, and we will be giving you a lot of information over the next 4 weeks. So we all know that the world has changed greatly since we have had the privilege of being in high school and entering our chosen professions. The world has changed greatly, I would say, in the last year. So the skills necessary for our students are very different than what we perhaps may have needed when we were going through high school, college, and etc. So the question becomes, how do we best prepare our students for learning? So much more goes into it now than reading, writing, and arithmetic. We work to develop the whole child. We recognize that our students are dealing with issues that many of us never had to encounter when we were growing up. So as we develop this budget over the next few weeks, we keep all of that in mind. We center our work around our mission statement, which I share with you every year, and we think about our students' needs not only for the upcoming school year, but also for future years beyond. So as I mentioned, in a moment, Mrs. Pilate is going to provide some information about the proposed budget, how it evolves, and 2 other resolutions that we would like to offer to our homeowners this year. You will note, I will note for you, that revenues and expenses have not really changed very much. Salaries and benefits make up about 3/4 of our projected expenses. And of course, our homeowners unfortunately still shoulder the burden of funding our budget. Overall, proposed state aid is increasing by 3.58%, and our foundation aid, for which there are no proposed formula changes or updates right now from the governor, by 1.9%. The governor's proposal provides a 0.25% increase in foundation aid to West Islip. So all the other increases are accounted for through the expense-driven aids, and there are no guarantees on those aids because it is driven primarily by our demographics. The governor has also proposed consolidating 11 expense-based and categorical aid formulas, including BOCES and our transportation aids, into something called a new services aid. And that proposal would not affect our aid until 2020-2021, but it would not be tied to our actual district expenses and instead would grow annually based on the inflation rate and an adjusted student count. So in other words, it would be capped. The governor has proposed making the property tax cap permanent. We have advocated for that. It will help us to project future budgets and what our expectations are and what we need to do to sustain our programs. I'm sure you're aware that the property tax cap is set to expire at the end of the 2020-2021 school year. So that is something that we are keeping our eye on. We are still in the process of enrolling incoming kindergarten students, and we are just beginning the course enrollment process at the high school, so we are not going to talk about course sections or class sizes this evening. We will talk about that at a future work session. However, we do continue to face declining enrollment. This has been a trend, as you know, for many years, and this year we anticipate 375 of our students will be graduating from the high school. We expect to enroll approximately 260 kindergartners. Pretty substantial decrease in enrollment. Our overall enrollment will decline by approximately 3%. That is consistent with the decline for the last two, I would say 3 years. Every year we seem to see a 2.83%, 3.1% decline in enrollment. I am pleased to say that as of this point, we have not made any cuts in the current year's budget. We do not plan to do so for 2019-20, assuming that the aid from the state stays as is or is increased. The budget is a work in progress, and we may lose some positions due to attrition. They have not yet been determined, but we do not plan on making any cuts to staff. We also continue to revise the instructional program to provide support and learning to our students in this ever-changing world, and those supports come in the realm of both academic and the socio-emotional areas. Now, I would like to introduce Mrs. Alisa Pilate, who may be a new face to many of you. You've probably heard from her if you are within the district, and if you are from without. Mrs. Pilate joined the district in July as the Assistant Superintendent for Business. She began a career working as a tax staff accountant and audit manager for Ernst & Young, and previously held the position of Assistant Superintendent for Business in the Seaford School District. This evening, Mrs. Pilate will make her budget work session debut and take you through some information regarding the 2019-20 budget. No. Thank you. I can promise it's not that exciting. Good evening, everybody.
As with every year, our main goal for the budget is to have a balanced budget where your expenses equal your revenues. We also want to maintain our current programs and services while staying within the tax levy limit. This year, many districts are also faced with the financial transparency goal. As we always try to maintain financial transparency, we have an additional requirement this year. So not only do we have our independent auditors report on the website, and as we go throughout the process, we put various budget documents on our website, but beginning with the enacted 2018 budget, we are now required to submit to the Division of Budget, as well as New York State Education Department, a school funding transparency form. Essentially, the goal of this form is to take each district building by building and look at what the budget allocations are, the staffing, the demographics, and the enrollment. budget development process really starts in the early fall. We start to analyze trends. We have to estimate rates. As an example, there are estimates in our budget. Health insurance changes every January. So January 2020, the health insurance rates will change. However, we don't know what that is. But based on historical trends, we can estimate what that rate is going to be. We also request that all of the budget builders, all of our administrators, submit their budgets to us in early December. And central administration meets with each budget builder to go over their budget line by line. And of course, we have public work sessions in which the board discusses the budget. As many of you know, the tax cap was enacted with the 12-13 school year. And you might not realize that before the tax cap was enacted, the way the budget formula worked was essentially the model on the left. So a district would go out and identify all of their educational priorities. Then they would consider their budget and say, okay, what projected state aid are we going to have? What revenues do we anticipate that we're going to earn in the next year? And what they were left with was the tax levy. So that was the amount that they would go out to their community and say, okay, to balance this budget, we have to tax the community at this percentage, whatever that district deemed was appropriate. Ever since the tax cap was enacted, the budget formula was basically flipped upside down, and it looks like the model on the right. So now districts are forced to first calculate a restricted tax levy. The Office of the State Comptroller gives us a multi-step formula that we have to follow. So we develop our restricted tax levy first, and then we can go back and say, what are our educational priorities? What revenues do we anticipate earning next year? What state aid are we projected to receive? And that remaining balance to fund the budget is our expenditure plan. It's our budget for next year. As I mentioned, the tax cap was enacted with the 12-13 school year. And essentially, the tax levy limit, it just limits the amount that a district can increase their tax levy year to year by the rate of inflation, or 2%, whichever is less. And again, it's based on a multi-step formula. But it is important to remember that that formula has adjustments and exclusions, which can make the 2% greater or less. So it's important to realize that 2% is not always 2%. And I think this table demonstrates that. In the center column here, we have the history of the allowable levy growth factor. So as an example, for 2018, the rate of inflation was 2.44%. Now the formula states that the allowable levy growth factor is limited to 2% or the rate of inflation, whichever is less. So even though the rate of inflation was 2.44%, we're capped at 2%. Now the column on the right is our district's history of our allowable levy growth factor. And as you can see, the two don't match. And like almost every other district, they wouldn't match because of that formula. There's adjustments, there's exclusions. A very popular one is debt service. Many districts have had bonds, or currently have bonds, and they're paying debt service. That is one of the exclusions in the formula. So that alone will change what the allowable levy growth factor is for your district. This is very exciting. Comes right from the Office of the State Comptroller's website. So if you can't sleep at night and you want to look at the formula, there it is. I think a much better way to approach it is just to take you through step by step this formula. And I'm doing that because the first thing that we have to do as a district is on March 1st, we have to submit our tax levy. So that's going to be submitted to the Office of the State Comptroller by this Friday. And I'll just take you through West Islip's formulas, hopefully as easily as possible. So what you start with is your prior year tax levy. That's your 2018-19 tax levy that the district levied to their residents. You then multiply that by the allowable levy growth factor. So that factor is basically the increase in the full value of the real property in our town, in our districts. That really comes from any new construction, any additions, any improvements that are done to taxable property in our district. Now that factor will never be less than 1. And if it's greater than 1, that means we've had some growth in our community. We then add in the pilots from the prior year. For anyone who doesn't know, a pilot is a payment in lieu of taxes. So there are times when commercial property owners will enter into an agreement to pay a pilot payment, a payment rather than taxes, for a negotiated period of time. In this district, we only have one pilot, and that is at 75 Sunrise Highway. That is the vet medical center. So we take whatever revenue we believe we're going to receive, or we did receive from the prior year, and we also have another step here where we subtract out the taxes that are levied to pay for local capital costs. And essentially what that means is that's the tax levy that's necessary to support any expenditures for any resulting from any improvements. What it means for us is our debt service payments, and it's net of any building aid that we're going to receive. Okay, we then multiply this by the allowable levy growth factor. That was that center column that I had pointed out. So for this year, because the inflation was 2.44%, we're capped at 2%. So we're multiplying that by 2%. So now we do the same thing for the upcoming year, for 1920. What do we expect our pilot payments to be? We expect them to increase slightly, as you can see. It went up to, I think, 88,000. And what we are left with there, is the tax levy limit before any exclusions. We then do the same thing. We add back any tax levy that's necessary to pay for our debt service, and it is net of any building aid. The end result is our district's allowable levy limit. And this is West Islip's tax levy for 1920. That represents a 2.37% increase over the prior year. So what's on the ballot? Of course, the most important thing is our budget vote. But as Superintendent Burns mentioned, we also have two additional propositions that are going to be on the ballot this year. The first is a capital reserve, the establishment of a capital reserve. And the third is related to voter registration. A capital reserve is very important. It allows a district a way to save money to pay for future capital projects and costs without having to put that into their operating budget. So we are avoiding an increase in taxes to the taxpayer, as well as any incurred interest costs that we would have to assume if we had gone out for a bond. This allows us to, voter authorization is actually required. Voter approval is required to both establish and spend from a capital reserve. And this is, again, at no additional cost to the taxpayers, because the way a capital reserve is funded is similar to any other reserve fund that the district would have. It's funded from any surplus monies at year end. So every year, at the end of the fiscal year, we compare budget to actual. Because as I mentioned, there's things that happen, there's estimates in our budget, there are late retirements, there are things that are planned for that might not come to fruition, such as a special education cost for a certain placement that maybe that didn't happen. So you're never going to spend the exact amount of your budget. So those surplus monies are called fund balance. And at the end of the year, the district would allocate the remaining fund balance into their reserve funds. We have several. So we have workman's compensation, we have ERS related to the retirement system, we have unemployment insurance, as well as something called EBLR, which is the Employee Accrued Benefit Liability Reserve. So this capital reserve would be an additional reserve for us. The benefit of this is that in the future, if we wanted to do a capital project, we would go out to the public, notify the public what we wanted to do, how much it would cost, put it on a proposition, and ask for voter approval. So there's a vote that takes place before any monies can be expended. But again, the benefit is it is at no additional cost to the taxpayers.
So in the past, when we had a little extra money at the end of the year, we'd pick a fund to put it into, and then basically that money would be stuck there, right? So some years ago, the state, during the gap elimination years, the state made an exemption, and they said that districts could use some of their fund money for retirement incentives. But generally speaking, that money then just sits there forever. So this would give us a mechanism by which we can go back to the taxpayers and say, hey, we'd like to spend this amount on this, and do you approve?
The third proposition is a voter registration proposition. The way the district currently works is that any of our residents who would like to register to vote can only do so one day in May for about 6 hours. there is continuous voter registration. So this proposition will allow our district clerk to register any voter between the hours of 8 a.m. and 4 p.m. whenever school is in session, which makes it much more convenient for our residents. At the end of this year, this fiscal year, we will have 3 board trustee seats that will become open. And on March 11th, the nominating petitions for those seats will be available at district office. We will have 3 additional budget work sessions in this cafeteria at 7:30 on March 12th, 26th, and April 9th. And the board will be adopting the budget on April 16th. And on April 22nd, those nominating petitions are due back to the district clerk. May 9th is our public budget hearing, and most importantly, on May 21st is our budget vote. Thank you.
Anybody have any questions?
So our next gathering will be 2 weeks from this evening, as Mr. Geller pointed out, and we will be discussing curriculum, extracurricular activities that night, technology, special education, everything related to some of the direct services that we provide to our students.
Don't want to miss it.
That one you don't want to miss.
So if you've never attended these before, you'll see that we kind of sneak up on this because when we start out, we don't really know what our end pot of money is going to be. As we don't know what the requirements are yet, so we don't know the staffing yet, and most even bigger, we don't know what the final state aid numbers are. So we're kind of we go through this iterative process of determining what we want, what we don't want, and what we can afford, and then make the ultimate decisions, of course, based on that with the input from all of you. So. Please, let us know what you think as we go along. Thank you very much.